Bienvenidos a todos, ¿cómo están en este nuevo episodio de ShotsConCiencia? Estamos muy contentos de recibirlos una vez más aquí con nosotros. En esta ocasión estamos muy emocionados porque tenemos una entrevista muy especial. La vamos a hacer en el idioma inglés porque nuestro invitado viene de Canadá. Y pues bueno, vamos a hablar sobre los trastornos del espectro alcohólico fetal en los salones. Y bueno, ya saben que los ShotsConCiencia es un espacio de difusión de la investigación de investigaciones sociales en donde buscamos compartirles información basada en evidencia. Y si no estoy yo, está Esteban Noya, nuestro coordinador de ciencia y estrategias preventivas. Okay, so Stacey, welcome. How are you?
I'm doing wonderful. How are you doing?
We're doing good right here in Mexico.
Wonderful.
Okay, well, I was just telling our audience that we have a very special guest today. This is our very first English interview, so we are kind of nervous here. But well, we will try our best, okay? We've talked before about fetal alcohol spectrum disorders here at ShotsConCiencia. However, this is the first time that we can address this issue with something related to the action around the evidence. So we are very happy to have you here. I will take 2 minutes to read your bio, if you allow me.
Yes.
Okay, so Mr. Stacey Kelsh, he's from POPFASD, the program lead, provincial educator and teacher with over 20 years of experience in public education. Stacey taught and led in a wide range of learning environments. His roles have included classroom teacher, elementary, middle, and high school, resource teacher, university sessional instructor, provincial educator, and provincial program lead, giving him experience spanning elementary through post-secondary education. Stacey is deeply grateful for the opportunity to learn alongside leaders in the field of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder and to share this knowledge with the educators across British Columbia through his work with the Provincial Outreach Program for FASD. He's passionate about supporting educators in strengthening their practice and expanding their capacity to reach, teach, and meaningfully include students impacted by prenatal alcohol exposure. So, Stacey, we were just saying earlier that we met you and we were amazed by your work and we became instant fans of your work. We are very happy to have you here. So let's start. Could you share a little bit about what POPFASD does in Canada?
Absolutely. First of all, wonderful English. I'm honored to be here to be your first English interview, and I'll do my best as well with my English. So POPFASD, we are a provincial outreach program. So if you can imagine, the province that we live in is British Columbia. And within our province, we have a government that focuses on education and childcare. That government entity, it has 10 different provincial outreach programs to support the learners in our province in their diverse learning needs. So that looks like students who may have autism, students who may have Down syndrome, students who may have needs for assistive technology, who may be deaf, hard of hearing, and we have the provincial outreach program for fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. So our role, we have an 8-person team. 4 of us are previous classroom teachers. We have a speech and language pathologist on the team, 2 techs and a clerical. And together we work to provide training and resources and consultation and support to almost 100,000 educators in British Columbia. So we have a very exciting role that we play in improving the outcomes of students with FASD. Our mandate is from the government. So our mandate, what we're told to do is to enhance educators' capacity to support students with FASD. And we do that through an FASD-informed approach that benefits all learners. And we're going to talk about that today because I'm super excited about that FASD-informed approach. And as well, I appreciate you sharing that you love the work and you're a big fan. But the wonderful thing about POPFASD is that nothing happens individually. We are an incredible team both with our core team of the 8-person team, but the structure exists in a way that we also have what's called district partners. So if you can imagine, maybe the state. So one thing I didn't mention in my introduction there was that my first year teaching was in Monterrey, Mexico. And that is in the state of Nuevo León, as you know.
Yes.
And if you can imagine the state of Nuevo León in Canada, in British Columbia, it's broken up into 60 school districts. So you can imagine the state of Nuevo León being broken up into 60 separate school districts. In each school district, which may have like 10,000, 20,000 teachers and students, we have a POPFASD district partner. So someone who works in that school district that we provide extensive training and resources and support to, so they can support the students within that school district as well. So we have over 90, so we have our 8-person team. We've got over 90 district partners who all work in the school districts and volunteer their time. And then we also have a steering committee team who are in the upper levels of directors of inclusion, the government, that helps guide the direction that our program takes when we look at kind of what kind of resources, what kind of training do we want to provide to meet the needs of educators. And it's together as a team that we support over 5,000 teachers per year directly. So we're very busy, but it's a wonderful opportunity to really help and support students. And I will say that in Canada, studies have shown by Dr. Svetlana Popova that the prevalence rate of FASD in Canada is around 4%. And our population is, I think, around like 38 million people. So that 4% ends up being, almost 1 out of 25 students in each classroom throughout British Columbia and throughout Canada would meet the criteria for a diagnosis of FASD. Mm-hmm. And I looked at the statistics for in Mexico, which is a population of 132 million, and some work from Dr. Svetlana Popova as well, because she's done global studies on the prevalence of alcohol exposure and FASD. And in Mexico, they have found it to be between 2 and 3%. So really thinking about as we go into today's session is that it is very likely that for every educator throughout Mexico, throughout Canada, the United States, that there will be students who will be having challenges and strengths, but associated with that prenatal alcohol exposure. So that's a little bit about POPFASD, and we're super excited to be sharing some more about the work that we do.
Thank you, Stacey. That's amazing. And here, sadly, we don't have more data for you. We would love to have more in the upcoming years. However, I love that message. Like, they might be around us. They might be there in our classrooms. And, we have a lot of learning complications, learning disadvantages here in Mexico as well. So I am sure that the educators that listen to you today might find like a new hope around these kids that might have something, and it's not autism, or maybe they don't fit into a special or a diagnosis. And well, maybe we have to start thinking about prenatal alcohol exposure. So thank you so much for sharing that and for trying to make some numbers for our country.
Yeah. And just a quick note there, within the title of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, that term spectrum is really important, because even if a youth or an individual was prenatally exposed to alcohol, they may not, depending on how much alcohol, depending on maternal factors, paternal factors that we're understanding more and more about now, health, age, all of these different things. It impacts the impact of that alcohol exposure. So you may have students that might not qualify for a full diagnosis of FASD, but will have a variety of challenges along that spectrum because of that alcohol exposure. In Canada, it's around 10% of pregnancies are alcohol exposed. And that happens because, you know, a lot of times about 40 to 50% of pregnancies in Canada are unintended or unplanned. And that's a pretty a statistic that happens in the United States. It's around 40 to 50% and throughout most of the world. So
in Mexico too, it's almost 50 to 60%.
50 to 60%. There we go. So alcohol exposure, it's not a matter of, parents not caring or understanding. It's just part of life when alcohol is a part of our lives, which for the most part it is.
Yes, that's true. Okay, so can you tell us, please, when we talk about FASD informed classrooms, I think you have told us some of it now, but what do you mean by that?
Excellent. Yes. So an FASD informed classroom, it's not about changing significantly or a special program or, you know, doing something drastically different. It's about understanding the impact of prenatal alcohol exposure on learning, on behavior, and on regulation. And there's a lot of research out there about how that alcohol exposure can alter the structure and the function of the brain. And the tricky part is that it's typically what's known as a hidden disability, because there's like in less than 10% of those impacted by prenatal alcohol exposure, in less than 10%, there's some facial features that aren't very obvious. But over 90%, they'll look like you and me. And you know what? For all I know, you know, that could have been a part of my history too, and for many of us. So it's a hidden disability. So the first thing is understanding the impact of that prenatal alcohol exposure, what it could present as, and then the second thing is around now that we understand the impact, now we can look at how do we best design, teach, and support students who may be impacted. So that's an FASD informed classroom. Those two simple things is understanding how it impacts the brain, the learning and behavior, and then looking at now what do we do? So this next section we're going to kind of get into is what does an FASD informed classroom kind of look like? Well, part of that understanding how it impacts learning and behavior and regulation is understanding that there's going to be uneven patterns of strengths and uneven patterns of challenges. And something that a student may be, as teachers who may be listening, or parents or community supports, something that they may have been able to do one day, they might not be able to do the next day. And that's really important as a classroom teacher, as if you're FASD informed, if they're not able to do it the next day, is being curious. Okay, what's going on here? Because all too often we move to use of consequences or trying to use rewards. And if it's consistently happening where each day is so different, which is a common characteristic of FASD, then our supports should work towards building those missing and lagging skills. Students with FASD can be easily or often overwhelmed when, as educators, we're overwhelming them with too much our expectations and demand on their cognitive abilities or capacity. So we know that alcohol exposure impacts memory, it impacts attention, it impacts regulation, it impacts executive function, it impacts sensory processing. So all of these pieces are altered from birth, and we can't really see it. But what we do see is often when we overwhelm those is a variety of different kind of symptoms of FASD, or known as behaviors. It might look like shutting down. It might look like non-compliance. It might look like disrespect. It might look like all of these things. But because you're an FASD informed classroom, you recognize that we have overwhelmed their ability to learn. We've overwhelmed their ability to regulate. And often those behaviors, it's said that behavior is communication, or the behaviors we see, and this is from Natasha Lawrence, who's a registered clinical counselor who also presented in Seattle at the international conference. She says that behavior is a way to regulate. So those are things that as educators, we recognize the impact on the brain and the body. We can see those and reframe those behaviors and look to support as opposed to penalize and consequence. And I've been there as a classroom teacher where before I became FASD informed, I would try to use consequences And they would do the same thing the next day and the day after, and they would just keep getting consequences, and I'd up those consequences, and it didn't matter. They just kept on, and that's because it's a brain-based disability. So that's where that FASD informed classroom is really important. Also, that dysregulation piece is really important to know too. So when students get overwhelmed really easily and really quick, a lot of the research has been done and shown that that prenatal alcohol exposure impacts what's called the HPA axis, that hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And that's our body's stress response system. So that alcohol exposure is known to particularly impact that. So our students with FASD are typically more elevated throughout the day and have less kind of reserve in order to support that regulation. And often when, as teachers and administrators, when a student becomes dysregulated, we try to talk a whole bunch. We try to talk them down, or we try to say, if you do that again, you're going to get this, and it amps and it amps and amps, and it causes that complete dysregulation. Just like any kind of disagreement we may have with people we care about. If it keeps going up and up, up, it's going to explode. Yes. And that unfortunately happens a lot, leading to in those classrooms where teachers don't know that their students' challenges are due to that prenatal alcohol exposure and that invisible brain and body-based disability. And then we are looking at least in Canada, we're looking at disciplinary actions, which look like suspensions, expulsions, detentions, all of these things. And we know that the alcohol exposure results in that developmental delay. So what that looks like is these students that are missing and lagging skills in these areas in the classrooms with their peers who are on a developmental trajectory where they're doing well, like they're able to kind of proceed at a typical development trajectory. And students with FASD, they need more time. They need more opportunities and repetition and structure. And when we penalize or we consequence and we discipline and detention and suspensions and expulsions, all those kind of things, it takes away time they could be learning, that they really need to be a part of that learning environment so they can continue to progress. So that's part of that. In an FASD informed classroom, we're looking at some just a number of different strategies we can consider. Would be like, one instruction at a time to help that processing, using visual supports. I would imagine that when I'm listening to you and Maria talk at the beginning, I'm picking up just a little bit of each thing you're saying in Spanish, but as soon as I hear that, it's kind of gone. And that's the same for students with FASD. Because of memory, because of attention, a lot of the verbal language that we use in our classroom, they're listening and they're trying to piece it together. And as soon as they get the next thing, they've lost the other part. And so what happens is now, if a teacher's teaching a lesson and they go through the whole, what are we going to do? This is why we're going to do it. Okay, now start. They often don't know what to do because there was just so much information that they needed to process and it's gone. So that's where visual supports are really important, and having that structure and repetition there so they can kind of build in those routines within the classroom. And then, breaking those larger tasks into smaller, manageable tasks are really, really important so that they can achieve one step at a time, as opposed to having something, that can be really overwhelming. And then extra processing time. So students with FASD often need time to process that information, whether it's visual or verbal, just like I do when you guys were speaking Spanish together. If you're speaking slower, I can pick out a lot more. And, from my year of teaching in Monterey, that was 20 years ago, man, a long time ago, but I can pick it out still a little bit. But if you go slower, it's so much easier for me. So, and then I think a really key factor when we think about FASD for informed classroom is that alcohol exposure is going to alter the structure and the function of their brain differently for each and every child. So when they say when you meet one student with FASD, you've met one student with FASD, because the alcohol exposure, the amount, the timing of that gestational period, the maternal health, the paternal health, all of these factors result in different impacts. So how do we know how to best teach that specific student? It's around relationships. So relationships are key, especially because students with FASD often experience challenges and their families of being misunderstood because of that hidden disability with their friends. You know, if they're struggling with memory, if they're struggling with social situations, social cues, things like that, they're constantly masking. So they're constantly trying to put on, like, show that they are able to keep up with everyone else. And it's exhausting, and it's really, really difficult. So as a teacher, getting to know that student, finding out what their strengths are, what their interests are, what those challenges are. And when you have that, now you can be more attuned to supporting them where they're at in that classroom and in that school. And you can also support the other teachers, because it's not just in your classroom where that student's going to struggle academically. It's on the playground if you're elementary. It's in the hallway when you're high school. You know, it's at the mall. It's wherever, you know, that child and that family goes, that there's going to be difficulty. So that relationship is key. So if I were to say, you know, to boil that FASD informed classroom down to 3 things, because I've been talking for a little bit. One is that educators understand the impact of prenatal alcohol exposure on the brain and that body. And then the second one is recognizing that those behaviors are symptoms of FASD. They're not choices, they're not deliberate, they're not disrespectful, but they are when their brain and body become overwhelmed. And then finally, the third thing is that we use that information to create learning environments that support that child's needs.
Stacey, this is so interesting. Yeah, I love what you said about recognizing, since that is like the base of an informed FASD classroom, or an informed society about, you know, about FASD. And, you know, here in Mexico, as you were saying earlier, we are millions. So that means that our classrooms are full and our teachers have their hands full. So what you said about the uninformed FASD classroom is not changing the way you are having your school structure.
Right.
So I think that there might be some misconceptions about an FASD informed classroom. Like, does that mean more work for me? Does that mean I have to be teaching 2 separate lessons in the same class? You know, like these type of myths. So can you share some of them? Have you heard some, or of what you have from your experience?
Those experiences are the same as in Canada. Absolutely. Complex classrooms, diverse learning needs, not enough time to address the curriculum and teachers don't want to do an entirely different curriculum, and they don't need to. So you're 100% right. I would just say that, yes, absolutely, about that FASD being in our classrooms. I think what was the population of Mexico? 132 million. And the research from Svetlana Popova was 2 to 3%, which is like around 3 million individuals in Mexico would have significant impacts enough to get a diagnosis of FASD. So we're, yes, absolutely in our classrooms in Canada and Mexico. You don't need to do anything drastically different. And in fact, when you support a student with FASD by, you know, slowing down your instructions, using visuals, being consistent, predictable, structure, routine, repetition, all of these pieces, when you do that, it benefits all the learners.
Yes.
And that's the thing, is like, and that was part of our mandate at the very beginning, because a lot of, you know, even though our prevalence rate in Canada is 4%, the majority of our students impacted by prenatal alcohol exposure will not have a diagnosis of FASD. We have a great diagnostic system. It still needs a lot of improvements in capacity within Canada, but the majority of the students who are having significant challenges due to alcohol exposure don't have a diagnosis. And so this is why, yes, our mandate says an FASD-informed approach that benefits all learners. So if you can imagine, like, the very, very base, if we provide those strategies and interventions to support students with FASD, also known as a universal, in education, it's called MTSS, which is a multi-tiered system, where everyone receives universal strategies and supports to support the majority of your class. And then you have targeted supports, and those are going to be for more specific needs. And often the students with FASD would fit in there, students with autism, students with deaf and hard of hearing, students with, learning disorders, things like that. And then you have the top triangle, which is intensive supports, where that's where you're going to bring in more specific school psychologists, speech and language pathologists. I mean, they're also in tier 2, but the universal approach, an FASD informed approach fits in there, and it benefits all the learners. So, when you asked there about the myths and misconceptions, I think often some of the biggest myths and misconceptions that we see in Canada is around students with FASD just need to try harder. And that kind of is part of that inconsistency. And inconsistency is a hallmark often seen in those with FASD. So that was what we were chatting about earlier, of like, they can do it one day, but not the next. And so as a classroom teacher, I've been there, especially with students who I didn't know how to diagnose as FASD, and those who did. And so my approach was, come on, you can do this. I know you can do this because you've done this before. And the more pressure I put on them, even though it was with good intentions, the more overwhelmed they got, because they knew that they could do it. And now today, it's just not there. And we also know that from the research. It's called cognitive load. And you and I, we all have a certain amount of capacity and cognitive load that we can do each day. Things that may impact you and I and everybody else here our cognitive load each day is like sleep, the nutrition, the complexity of the task. If I was to try to do this in Spanish, that would be super overwhelming for me. But for you, it'd be a lot easier. Right. So there's a lot of different factors that overwhelm our cognitive load. And for teachers that think that they could just often that misconception is that they're not trying. And that's why that next day they're not able to do it. It's because they're not trying. And then they often will use consequences or, even rewards, and those don't fit. And then they get more consequences and et cetera, down that line. We also, that behavior piece, a big misconception and myth is that students with FASD are behavior students and, will end up experiencing really, really tough situations, incarceration, things like that. But that doesn't have to be the case at all. That's a huge myth, because if we as society, as education, as our social supports, provide early interventions and support through school, we know that it improves life outcomes. So that's a big one too. And also that the behaviors we see is that's their choice. But again, we know that that's not the case, because it's all about overwhelming their brain and their body's ability to cope. There's a really good quote from Dr. Ross Green, and he says, kids do well if they can. And that's been my experience as a teacher. And if anybody here has kids at home, or, if they want to do well, right? Like kids that come into our classroom, they want to look and, they don't want to stand out in front of their classmates. They want to do well and be seen as doing well. It's when we overwhelm their capacity and their ability that we start to see that elevation. And it's no different if anybody, has ever raised a 1-year-old or a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old, right? And we see what happens when the nutrition is off, or, they haven't had their snacks, and we're asking them to do more and get into the car and all this kind of stuff. And you could just see that elevation. So that's a big one too. The other myth and misconception is that consequences, if you provide the right consequence, they will learn from it. But it's a missing and it's a lagging skill. And the only thing that can support, just like any of us, is instruction and support. For example, when you and I were learning how to read way back many years ago, if I was 3 and 4 and 5 and learning how to read, and I was just getting consequences for not being able to read, but no instruction, I wouldn't be able to read to this day. And I would actually hate to read. I'd have this really, negative feeling towards it. So it's the same thing with a lot of, youth with FASD. Their structure and function of their brain has been altered so that they need more time and more opportunities. It's called frequency, duration, and intensity. Those are the 3 things that really allow for us all to learn anything: frequency, intensity, and duration. for reading, for math, whatever it might be. For those with FASD, because of the impacts of prenatal alcohol exposure, they need that more often in order to keep up with their peers or in order to just continue to learn. But unfortunately, we move to consequences all too quick. And then we miss that learning and they get even further behind. And then finally, the last one that I wanted to highlight is that around capability, capacity. Students with FASD have incredible strengths and wonderful interest and are such an important part of the classroom community and the school. When I think about my favorite students I ever taught, they were the students who were impacted by prenatal alcohol exposure. Often they're social and they want to try and they do their best. And if they get the right supports, man, they can really thrive. But what happens is we sometimes don't presume competence or ability, and we lower our expectations. And when we do that, in anything, our expectations, people will, rise to whatever we set. So really important to have expectations for students with FASD that match their ability and to support them, because too high of expectations, they're just going to get frustrated. In education, it's called Vygotsky's zone of proximal development. And there's 3 layers of a circle. So on the very inside, it's like the safe zone. And that safe zone is where we kind of exist and we're happy to be there, but we're a little bit bored. We're not really learning. And then you move out to that stretch a little bit, and the outside circle outside of safe, that's that stretch. And so that's where we're kind of pushing ourselves. And then outside of that, but that's where that learning happens. Outside of that is the panic. And that's when it's like way too much. So really, when we teach students with developmental disabilities, we want to have them in that safe zone and bring them into that stretch and allow them to experience that, but being really attuned to it so we don't go into that panic. And then if they do go into that panic, providing that opportunity for regulation to come back to that safe zone, and kind of it's that balance of moving in between those. And often if we're not aware of that, we go to that panic, and then that dysregulation, overwhelm kind of happens. But yeah, there's students that we've worked with before. There's that are incredible musicians, incredible athletes. There's a young adult, maybe not a young adult anymore, but in their 30s out of the United States, who also presented at the international conference in Seattle, and she just did her PhD. And incredible speaker, Dr. Emily Hargrove. So it's the abilities of those with FASD are vast, and exciting that in education we get to help support those if we are FASD informed.
Yes. That sounds amazing. And I love what you said about, like these universal benefits for everyone, because as you were talking, I was like, who wouldn't benefit from instructions or from breaking them down or from this like more visual environment? Like that's benefit from all of us. Like that will benefit all of us. It sounded me also a little bit, I'm a dietitian, so it sounds a lot like this mindful eating, like return to your ground point, or return to this, or let it sink in, let the flavor sink in, when we are like giving this orientation. So it sounded a lot like that. And I want to ask you, Stace, if all these misconceptions that you just told us, are they barriers for this program from POPFASD to get implemented?
That's a great question. I think, who is it, Maya Angelou, that said that when you know better, you do better. And I think that's part of understanding these myths and misconceptions, is that once educators learn about the impact of prenatal alcohol exposure, it changes their practice, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But so I don't think that, to some extent they are barriers, but I think the biggest barrier that we often see around education and FASD and FASD informed classrooms are time and access to training. And so as educators, you have only so many days per year that you're able to access professional learning within that school system. And I'm not too sure about Mexico, but, and many like myself and maybe as a dietitian, Did you learn about FASD when you were taking your courses? Yeah,
No.
I never learned about it either. And I took special education classes. So most of the educators that are in the system, both in Mexico, Canada, United States, they never had opportunities to learn about it. But once they do, it has a big impact. And an important part too, another quote from Dr. Ross Green, and I highly recommend if you're interested in more kind of around, he doesn't focus on FASD, but it's more around supporting the complexities within the classroom. But he shares, another one of his good quotes is that your interpretation drives your intervention. So once we learn and we think about those myths and barriers around inconsistency, behavior, consequences, strengths, if our interpretation, if we didn't have that, we would interpret the inconsistency as choice, or the behavior as just a bad kid, not good parents, the consequences, they just need more consequences. We would interpret that and our as such, and our intervention would probably be more consequences. It would be that behavior, they don't deserve to be at this school, or that inconsistency, they're not trying. However, once they've taken the training, now they interpret that as, oh, that's a missing and lagging skill. That is a brain that's overwhelmed. And so now our interpretation is, okay, how can we address the environment? How can we go back and have that conversation with, hey, when you started to get dysregulated there, what was happening? Being curious as teachers so that we can, in the future, prepare ourselves and how we design and how we teach and how we support that student, so that dysregulation, overwhelm, frustration doesn't boil over. Another barrier would be our own kind of bias and our own expectations of students. Our current school systems, and it was the same in Monterrey, was around what education currently values. And so right now, if you think about it, as a teacher, I'm valuing independence, like that student could sit down and do that study or do that report, themselves, or, lead another team. I'm also valuing attention. Can they pay attention to me as I'm teaching up there? Are they looking? Are they interacting with me the whole time? Are they compliant? If I ask them to do their homework, are they going to do their homework? Are they consistent? So all of these things that we value right now often are areas of challenge for kids with FASD. And so if we don't know that, or anyone along that spectrum, right, without the diagnosis and all of that, if we don't know that, then the barrier is going to be our approach to making that a positive learning environment for them. So ways to support those, is valuing the diversity of our classrooms and supporting them. Like you said, it's nothing different, because it's not just, you don't have a class full of typical students with no neurodevelopmental difficulties, right? They are very busy, 28, 30 students, a variety of needs, trauma, attachment, autism, all across the board, so many different, challenges that a teacher and an educational assistant are trying to support. And so the FASD informed approach really supports all of those, because it's not just students with FASD that struggle with attention, ADHD. It's not just students that struggle with FASD struggle with compliance, or, all these pieces. So really thinking about that FASD informed approach is like, can you repeat those instructions? So that student that may have missed it because their attention was off, can you repeat them? Can you be more patient? As a teacher, we can support through what's called co-regulation. And as parents, we see this all the time too. If our child is elevated and we get elevated with them, it's just this match of going back and forth. But if that child is elevated and we come in and we recognize that we are the adult here, and we can help bring them down through our voice, our tone, space sometimes, and then we can work with them. So there's a neuropsychologist called Dr. Bruce Perry, and really, really famous, neuroscientist. But he has what's called the 3 R's. And this happens, for education, when students become dysregulated. The bottom is to help support that regulation, because there's no teaching that can happen if they are frustrated or if they're elevated. And that's just like us too. Our brain, it shuts down. We're in our downstairs brain when we become overwhelmed. So we need to just like support that regulation as that very bottom first step. Then that next step, we're looking at relating. So being like, just like we would with our own kids, like, yeah, I'm sorry. We were really looking forward to going to the park today. And I get that you're upset. That's a big transition. That's a big move. And that happens in the classroom too. I know that you wanted to be in a group with Joey. And today it just didn't work out. I'm sorry that happened, kind of just relating. And then we can reason. At the very top of that triangle is reason. But if we try to reason with a student who's dysregulated, we're wasting their time, we're wasting our time, and we're just causing that dysregulation to happen. So I think that the expectations that we have as educators is a barrier, and our own biases. And then often in those complex classrooms, when we are overwhelmed, when we are dysregulated, often we go back to the practices that we were raised with. And unfortunately, those don't often support the complex needs in a classroom. So my, authority and kind of threats of consequences and things like that may have worked for me as a kid because I didn't want to get in trouble. And that just doesn't jive in today's, or I shouldn't say jive, that doesn't work in today's classrooms the same way individually it might have worked with us and our parents. So I think that complexity of the classrooms that really do cause educators to be really busy. They're tough places right now. Post-pandemic, post everything in Canada, the United States, the school systems are struggling with complex needs.
No, here in Mexico as well. And, I think we go back to awareness again, because maybe it just takes it only takes knowing this information, because you might think of a kid with the official diagnosis of FASD going into a classroom, and then you telling the teacher, this kid will have these challenges and so on, what you were just saying. But maybe it can also be like the other way. Like maybe you as a teacher can recognize these and maybe refer them to an official diagnosis. So it can be like both ways, like not just knowing that this kid might have FASD, but also recognizing it on some others who don't know they have it. So that's like this eternal loop of helping each other.
Absolutely. And you know what, I mean, that's a really tricky part of that as an educator referring a child for, say, a diagnosis of FASD, because similar throughout the world of my experience of that, there's still a ton of stigma that's associated with FASD. There's a ton of shame and blame on the mother for that alcohol exposure. And there's a ton of misconceptions and myths around that. And so a lot of families, caregivers are hesitant, or they may have strong feelings about going for a diagnosis of FASD. And that also exists of once that child has a diagnosis of FASD, every meeting, IEP, individualized education plan, which you have at least two meetings per year with each teacher. So going in there, like that's a lot on the caregivers at where we're at right now in society with FASD being highly stigmatized. So in Canada, if a child is having significant challenges, and we've taken some training around FASD, and we're like, we've tried all these different approaches, these universal strategies, we're thinking about those tiers, the targeted strategies, and we're still kind of struggling. That's when we would have that relationship piece, which is really important to have with the family and that child. That's when we would have the conversation being like, you know what, this may be a good time to have an appointment with your family doctor, have an appointment with a pediatrician. And that's where those conversations will come up, because in our society, they're a lot more, like within Canada, a lot more attuned to having those conversations. I know in different countries, it's quite a bit different. And there's still research around who gets asked more often. Families that may come. Unfortunately, there's still some racism that exists within when we know that alcohol exposure, it happens with everyone and anywhere that alcohol is present. It doesn't matter what your education background is, your financial status, whatever, right? Like it's just part of our society. So in Canada and in British Columbia, we put that to the doctors and to the pediatricians to have that conversation with the parents or caregivers. Was alcohol a part of the pregnancy? And then if that was, then they, could refer to a diagnostic clinic. And even if it wasn't a part of that, they could still get referred to, even if the parents said no, they could still get referred to a diagnostic clinic in Canada, in British Columbia, and they would do a multidisciplinary assessment. So they would still find a lot of information about why is this child struggling. So much so that the universal targeted intensive strategies are not having that impact. And then a really good comprehensive report from the multidisciplinary team, which is like a psychologist, a pediatrician, often a speech and language pathologist, occupational therapist. They would give a report on all these standardized assessments of where that child is. And then as the teacher and the teaching team, they could target their interventions to where the student may need them the most. But so it's a bit of a tricky of like as a teacher.
Yes, no, and it sounds very complex, when there's an ideal world that can happen, all these reference, and then we have all these specialists prepared for a diagnosis or to like this multidisciplinary team you were talking about. So that's also I think that's a barrier too, because not everyone has the access to it. So that's also 100%. Very important. Yes,
and that's a barrier in Canada as well, because in British Columbia we have 5 CDBC clinics. Well, they're our diagnostic clinics, and so in the city that we work out of, which is Prince George, we have a diagnostic clinic here. But then for 8 hours to the coast and 8 hours to the northern tip of our province, there's no other diagnostic clinics. And so they have to travel to get to this center, this hub here. And it's the same thing throughout the rest of the province. So, and if we're looking at families that may have low socioeconomic abilities and like education, funding, transportation, all of these pieces, finances, to be able to go to a hub city 8 hours away, that's a huge barrier.
Yes. Well, for example, if you could tell us about the benefits from an FASD informed class that you were saying before, like everyone gets a benefit from it, but what could you say about it? And if we wanted to start being an FASD informed class, what would be the very first step? You can tell me now the data, tell me some numbers.
Okay. Well, I'll start off with something that just came to my mind that you brought up, but it was around an FASD informed approach. And if I was to like kind of give that pitch of why this is so important, and before I go into the outcomes and things like that, is if we look at how we learn. Often if I'm sitting in the classroom, the first thing is my sensory system has to be in a place that I am regulated so that I am able to go move on to the next step, which is attention. Because if my sensory is all off, I'm not going to be able to pay attention. So I got the sensory, and then that goes to the attention piece. And if I'm paying attention and I'm focused, now I can move into what's called working memory. So now if you told me like the next step in today's lesson is going to be photosynthesis, and photosynthesis is this, I'm paying attention to you and I'm being able to attend, and I'm listening to photosynthesis, and that's in my working memory. And then you say something really about chlorophyll, and we do an activity, and now I'm able to move chlorophyll into my long-term memory. And then the more we repeat that and work with that, I'm able to retrieve that. Now, with those with FASD, that alcohol exposure has impacted often their sensory processing, their attention, their working memory, their long-term memory. So when we support those areas for students with FASD, whether they have a diagnosis or not, we are supporting the learning because that's the same process that we all go through. So if we're creating a classroom where that sensory processing, so maybe like kids aren't running around and really noisy or things are going on, and we're able to focus that part of that sensory, then our attention is going to improve. And if we're a classroom teacher and we know that like, hey, if I talk for 15 minutes, nobody's paying attention to me anymore. But if I talk for like 1 minute and then I connect it and I'm using that student's name to make sure that even within that 1 minute that they are now triggered to be like, okay, I'm paying attention because so all of these strategies that we do for the learning, the science of learning, the research that we understand, to support students with FASD, they benefit all learners. So that's my pitch, because every part of that process is impacted. And when you focus on improving your instructional approach for students with FASD, it improves it for everybody in that classroom.
No, I would love those strategies for me as an adult.
All right, well, come to my session. Come to my session.
Yes.
All right. Okay. So going to the results achieved. Absolutely. So POPFASD has been around for 20 years. And as educators, whether you're in Mexico, Canada, US, or wherever, we build our lessons off of feedback. So whether it's summative feedback or formative feedback, we're constantly needing to find out where are the students at, what do we need to focus on, how do we improve? And our provincial outreach program, because we are all educators and we're able to take that information, the research, the recommendations, the science of learning, science of reading, all of these pieces, and apply it through a lens, a classroom teacher's lens, so that it really connects with classroom teachers. And so because we've been there, we understand what happens. And so it's a really good way to be able to connect. And we hear that in our feedback from all of our presentations and our training. So the past 20 years, a big part of what we do is getting that feedback from educators of like, what are you taking away? What stood out to you? What are your big lessons that you learned? And so we're constantly building off of those. And the feedback is always overwhelmingly positive. And we also have a luxury, because as educators, as teachers, EAs, administrators in Canada and British Columbia, for the most part, you get to choose what training you want to go to. We typically have like 5 professional learning days per year where the teachers get to select what they want to learn about. And so the educators that come to our training and come to our online live streams, our on-demand courses, they are choosing it. So they already know that they want to be there. And sometimes as classroom teachers, not all the students always want to be there. So it can be a little bit of a challenge at times. But the feedback is always overwhelmingly positive because they're coming to our sessions. They want to learn more. They're learning more, and it's impacting their classroom practice. And we know that from the feedback that we get from them right after the sessions, but also we did a 4-year study of our provincial outreach program with Queen's University, which is a very prominent university within Canada. And it identified 80% of 80 to 90% of the teachers learned more from the sessions that they took. And they kind of did this external evaluation of all the different training options that we offered. But the big part was, and the exciting part was that 70% of educators changed their practice. And so that's really tough. And that was 4 weeks afterwards. Because as we know, and as I know, those 5 days that we go to professional learning is exciting. We go there, we do that, but then we get back into the classroom and boom, reality hits. 30 kids, complex needs, moving around, and you just resort back to what you know. But the research is showing that that their practice has been changed 4 weeks afterwards. So we know that it's having this awesome impact.
It just takes time. Yes.
It takes time.
Yes.
And you don't, and we'll talk about this in a second though, you don't have to do so much right away either. It's small steps, it's working together. My first experience with POPFASD was the classroom that I taught in for the majority of my teaching career, which was 9 years. and I taught grade 5, 6, and 7 in one of our province's most complex classrooms. Or schools. And so it's elementary school, kindergarten to grade 7. Right now, about 50% of the students have a ministry designation. So they either have autism, ADHD, FASD, learning disabilities, English as a second learning language. So it's very, very complex. And it was in there that POPFASD came in and did a training and did a session. And I learned about processing time. Often, Diane Malbim, she's a very prominent researcher and advocate in the field of FASD. She has a really valuable quote when we think about supporting students with FASD. She says that students with FASD are 10-second kids in a 1-second world.
Ooh.
And so when we think about like this presentation, I'm hoping that the subtitles, the captions keep up, because I'm speaking too quickly. I know that. But in that classroom is really like slowing down because of that processing. Mm-hmm. And when I learned about that, my classroom was, classrooms were always quite challenging. But when I learned about that, and I had one student in my classroom who had a diagnosis of FASD that year when POPFASD came in, I slowed it down, and it didn't just help that one student. It helped out all of the students. And it's the same thing with bringing in visuals and a couple other things that, like, I think it was like 2 things that I pulled out of that session that was 30 minutes that made a huge difference. So I know that personally, professionally, that the information and that knowledge around FASD or alcohol exposure and how it impacts learning, behavior, and regulation, it changed the way I taught, and it shows. We also see increased collaborations with families, students, community supports. And, I think a big goal of our program is around raising awareness of FASD. And when we do that, and we break down those myths and those misconceptions and those barriers, we are reducing stigma. And the more that we can reduce that stigma, the more support we can provide the families, and the more support that society will want to invest in individuals with FASD. So, the results that we hear consistently from our training is that we're supporting them to provide environments that recognize students' strengths, reduce barriers to learning, and then also provide these like genuine opportunities to thrive. So those are the 3 kind of pieces there of like kind of the core of what we do.
Oh, Stace, that is so amazing. I would love to hear like the whole day, listen to you talk about this. But that's where we are going next. Excellent. We are very happy to announce right now that you will be giving one of our specialized workshops in our next FASD International Conference here in Mexico that is taking place next 9th and 10th. September 9th and 10th, and you will be here as one of our main speakers and also as a workshop facilitator. So if you can you have 30 seconds to tell everyone who is listening to us, why should they attend your workshop?
Okay, 30 seconds. Woo! As we've shared before, it's all about learning about how alcohol impacts the brain and the body. And these are strategies, interventions, approaches that support all learners. And you know what? It's about that building your understanding and then using that understanding to design, teach, and support. And I'm excited. I've been teaching for 20 years. And I love to teach, and it will be a great time, and you will learn. And even if you don't have a student with a diagnosis of FASD, it is going to improve your teaching. Yes. And when that happens, your life is better, their life is better. It's a win-win.
Yes. Amazing, Stace. 30 seconds. Well, we are very happy to have you here. We are so excited that we will be having you in Mexico City. We can't wait to see you again. Is there any social media or somewhere we can follow your work, and then we will be happy to have you here?
Excellent. Yes, you could go to just Google in POPFASD, POPFASD, and you'll find our website, lots of free resources. So any schools, teachers that want to take, we've got a FASD on-demand course that's free. It's 6 modules. We get about like 1,500 educators that take it per year. And so it's free and available to caregivers, community supports, and please, and different live streams, things like that. You'll also probably see that we are hosting the very first Education and FASD International Conference. It's all online so that anybody around the world can access it. We have over 30 presenters who are experts in their field of FASD and supporting learners. So this is good for caregivers. This is good for educators. This is good for community supports, the work that FISAC does. So, and we have a neuroscientist that's Dr. James Reynolds, who's going to do the keynote. We've got individuals with living experience from around the world that also presented at the International Conference in Seattle coming in, but it's free. It's on October 23rd. And we would love to see a ton of people from Mexico attending. So that's a big thing. You'll see it on our website here in a little bit at the end of August. But we're just planning for that right now, and we're super excited. But I am very excited for September 9th and 10th to be there with all of you. I hear there may be some things happening within Mexico City. So that's super exciting. And just honored to be a part of this podcast, honored to be a part of the wonderful work that you are all doing. But yeah, please come join the sessions, the keynote, all that kind of stuff. I'm excited.
Yes, thank you, Stace. We are very, very excited too. Thank you for being here, and well, for all of our audience that is listening, we'll see you on our next episode. Thank you for joining, and well, see you soon, Stace.
Bye.